Hello, welcome. I am Professor Frederick Luis Aldama at The Ohio State University. I would like you to join me on this journey in the Planetary Republic of Comics. Today, more than ever, we're seeing the results of the rise of a Planetary Republic of Comics. The history of comics books is a global one. Comic book creators, the world over, are grown within respective national soils, but always with an insatiable appetite to learn from others beyond their proximate experience, and to learn from the many other visual and verbal arts. It is a history of global cross-pollination that includes the physical transmigration of artists and their styles and worldviews from one region or country to another. It is a history that increasingly includes the active participation of creators, editors, and translators in the publishing of comic books across historical periods and cultural contexts. This course will focus on making visible creators from around the world who have chosen to use visual and verbal devices of comics to give shape to fictional and non-fictional stories that make up our Planetary Republic of Comics. We will see how each country has grown its own distinctive styles and formats. The Franco-Belgian bande dessinée, or drawn strip, the Japanese manga, the Italian fumetti, the Spanish tebeos, the Latin American historietas, the German comic book, the Filipino comics, the Korean manhwa, and the Chinese lianhuanhua. We will see also how comics cross national boundaries. But to understand the whole system, we must first understand all of its subsystems, each comics tradition as grown within specific cultural sites and historical environments. To this end, this course will aim to identify how comic books are created within specific times and places, as well as to show how they exist within a planetary system of comics. The making of this planetary system of comics has been taking place for some time. Several scholars have considered its incipience, its birth, its beginnings, in any given moment from the history of the Bayeux Tapestry, for instance, when images were deliberately placed in sequence to tell stories, and others talk about a more modern epoch. Many scholars have spent time trying to peg the origin of the comic book. Was it in the year 1732 when painter and engraver William Hogarth created A Harlot's Progress? Or was it in 1885 when German Wilhelm Busch's Max and Moritz appeared? Was it in 1867 with the creation of the British character Alexander Ali Sloper? Was it in 1897 when German immigrant Rudolf Dirk created the Katzjammer Kids? Was it Filipino Jose Rizal's Monkey and Tortoise? Or perhaps it was crystallized sometimes later in the 20th century with the mass production of the Kashibonya manga in the 1920s Japan, or when Jerry Siegel and Jerry Schuster published Superman in 1933. This course will be less about sleuthing out origins than offering a way to understand comics as a global storytelling phenomenon that cuts across cultural and national boundaries, as well as generations of readers and creators. It is a fact that comics use the shaping devices found in arts, literature, painting, film, and so on. We know, for instance, that Milt Caniff and Hergé were hugely inspired by the talkies, and taken with the dynamic storytelling possibilities opened up with animation, Osamu Tezuka increased the number of panels to infuse a kinetic dynamism into his manga. In many ways, film and comics are close cousins, growing up together in the same household. So it's not surprising that we see a lot of cross-pollination here, and not only unidirectional. While many comic book author-artists learned from Orson Welles' extraordinary film talents, Orson Welles was also famously inspired by Milt Caniff's Terry and the Pirates. Of course, the Planetary Republic of Comics is also informed by other verbal and visual arts such as literature, woodcuts, painting, and photography. Early 20th century artist Franz Manzarill's woodcuts played a big role in Art Spiegelman's making of his own comic book style. With Frank Espinosa's contemporary Rocketto series, we see the influence of Joseph Conrad and German Expressionism. Comics are made and consumed all over the globe. Because of different histories of publishing, translating, and marketing, some countries like France, Belgium, and the US, Japan, and some countries of Latin America are better known as producers of comics. However, if one looks carefully, there's nearly no place on the planet that doesn't have some kind of tradition of comic book making and consuming. Let's take the example of manga. After World War II, manga began to explode as a national, then worldwide industry. The extraordinarily talented Osamu Tezuka set the bar high with his dynamic and engaging visual style, seen in his 1947 published Shin Takarajima, New Treasure Island, and his published in 1952 Tetsuwan Astro, or Astro Boy. The audience only grew larger with the arrival of the edgier, adult-oriented manga style arriving on the scene in the 60s and 70s. The gritty, socially and psychologically relevant Gekika manga, and with the Japanese economic boom of the 1980s, manga solidified its foothold as one of the dominant comic book styles read around the world. By the early 2000s, manga already accounted for 2/3 of all graphic novels in the US. In the 20th century Europe, the Franco-Belgian author Hergé, and together with the magazine Spirou, put bande dessinée on the world stage. Hergé's cool, clear ink lines used in Tintin caught the attention of readers, authors, artists, creators as readers all over the world. The comics that appeared in Spirou showed the world a different, more exaggerated and elastic style to tell stories. As comics and their authors increasingly moved across borders, we see intensified cross-pollination and regeneration of narrative forms. For instance, while there's no mistaking the Franco-Belgian entrenched style of the bande dessinée, established before and after World War II, it too experienced a transformation in later years. The contact of new generations of European creators with other comic book creators and traditions, such as that of the 1970s underground comic scene in the US, led to radical innovations both in form and content. For example, in France, there was the publishing of the all-female comics quarterly Ah Nana, that brought across the proverbial pond the work of US creators such as Trina Robbins, Sharon Ruda, and M.K. Brown. This greatly expanded French and Belgian comics traditionally filled with more staid and safe storylines such as seen with Tintin and Asterix, to include full frontal sex as well as homophobic issues faced by women and LGBT communities. As we already briefly mentioned, the shaping of a Planetary Republic of Comics also happens when actual creators transplant from origin to host country. For instance, during the repressive rule of Mussolini, in the late 40s, Italian comic book creator Hugo Pratt led a migration of Italian artists to Buenos Aires. Hugo Pratt worked alongside Argentine creator Hector Herman Osterheld, the creator of El Eternauta, along with others. They helped lead the change in what became a comics explosion in Argentina that lasted until the 1950s when the economy collapsed and many Italians returned to Europe. When Pratt returned to Italy, he brought back the styles and worldview of Argentine comics. For different reasons, political and personal, creators moved from one country to another, all while transforming the comic book scene of both countries. We see this in the Chilean-born creator Alejandro Jodorowsky, who spent his adult life living in Paris and Mexico City. It was his collaboration with Jean Giraud, known as Mobius, that radically transformed French bande dessinée into the daring, otherworldly stories seen in works like their sci-fi cosmic epic Linkal, a comic that dared to use dashed hatching and that filled its post-apocalyptic story world with Mexican symbology and social critique. This style came to be known as the Nouveau Réalisme of the early 1980s in France, and that was given further expression in the work of Jacques Tardy along with other Latin American transplants like Carlos Sampaio and Jose Munoz, who characterized their work by a shifting subjective vision of the real with engagement of the social and political in the construction of anti-heroic stories set in unstable realities. The internet has opened up even further the access to comics and also creators. With advances in communication technology, the world has shrunk. This has meant that creators in places like Japan can and are influenced by those in India and Europe and so on. The physical and virtual movement of creators and their comics is not a given, however. The global marketplace continues to prove an uneven playing field for many creating in countries outside of the US, Europe, and Japan. For this reason, readers and scholars of comics in the US know little of the creators and their exceptional comic book work in countries and regions of the globe with robust traditions such as the Middle East, Africa, and India, for instance. The global circulation and marketplace for comics tends to favor those written in or translated into English. And within this, it is often the superhero and manga comic book that tends to receive the kind of publishing push needed to cross national boundaries. Even the hugely popular and massively translated Asterix never really received the marketing support necessary for grabbing of a US audience. So while the inspirations, inceptions, and creations of comics is planetary, global economics tends to delimit that reach. The way comics move across borders is through translation. While the dominance of the storytelling format with the visuals help, in fact, many creators displaced from one country to another often reveal in interviews how they were able to learn their new host country through the exposure to comics. They still require a certain amount of translation for non-native readers to get the fullest out of the comic. And language is only one of the layers of translation possible when moving a comic across linguistic borders. It involves the translation of the visuals to capture the new host's other cultural tradition. It can also be constrained by publisher demands on new formats. In this course, we will see how comics have actively participated in the shaping of a world storytelling system built out of idiomatic and shared world storytelling mechanisms. Welcome.